Section 1. The Secret History of How South Park Was Born. There's a good chance you already know the broad strokes. Two guys from Colorado, construction paper, fart jokes, and 28 seasons of culture war. But the actual origin of this show, the real story of how it came to exist, is stranger and more interesting than most people realize. It starts not in a television studio, not in a writer's room, not even in a meeting between executives who saw a gap in the market. It starts in a college dorm room in Boulder, Colorado in 1992, with a film assignment that was never supposed to change anything at all, made by two young men who were mostly trying to make each other laugh and had no idea they were building something that would still be arguing with the White House 30 years later. Trey Parker was a film student at the University of Colorado. He had already made a name for himself among his classmates for a short animated film called American History, which he entered in a student competition and won a Student Academy Award for. The technique Parker used for that film was built around actual cutout pieces of construction paper and an old 8mm film camera. He moved the paper pieces frame by hand, photographing each increment of movement in the way that stop-motion animation demands. It was time-consuming, painstaking work, and the result had a particular quality that Parker understood immediately. There was something about that childlike, deliberately crude aesthetic that created a gap between how something looked and what it was saying. The visual style communicated innocence. What the film was actually doing was something else entirely. That gap between surface and content was interesting to him in a way he hadn't yet fully articulated, but which would define his entire creative identity going forward. He met Matt Stone in a film class, and they started spending time together, doing voices, riffing on ideas, finding the edges of what they could make each other do by escalating the premises of their jokes further and further past the point where most people would stop. The partnership was immediate, and the dynamic was clear almost from the start. Parker was the dreamer, the storyteller, the person with the bottomless appetite for making things and putting them in front of audiences. Stone was the analytical force, the critical perspective, the person who could look at a concept that seemed brilliant in the room and tell you whether it actually worked outside the room. Parker has described their collaboration as Stone being the person who tells him when a joke isn't as funny as Parker thinks it is, which is a very specific and very important role when your collaborator has Parker's creative momentum. In December of 1992, they made a short film for a class assignment. They called it The Spirit of Christmas. The premise was elemental. 4 children, rough prototypes of what would eventually become Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny, though not yet given those names, encountered a snowman that came to life and turned malevolent. Jesus Christ himself showed up to fight it. The whole thing was made with actual construction paper, actual glue, actual scissors, and that same 8mm camera. It took them several days. It screened at a student film festival, got some laughs, and then essentially disappeared into the void of student projects that nobody thinks about again once the semester ends. It was funny. It was rough. That was that. Or so it seemed. 3 years later, in 1995, a Fox broadcasting executive named Brian Graden entered the story. Graden had heard about Parker and Stone through the Hollywood network of people who were always passing around interesting and unusual things. He had seen their work. He had a specific problem. He wanted to send his friends something memorable as a video Christmas card, something that would stand out, something people would actually talk about. He paid Parker and Stone $2,000 to make a new version of The Spirit of Christmas, a professional commission with an actual budget and an actual delivery requirement. The production budget was reportedly around $750. Parker and Stone kept the remainder, which tells you something about the economics of underground animation in 1995, and also something about their negotiating instincts even before they had anything concrete to negotiate from. This new version was fundamentally different from the 1992 original. Instead of Jesus fighting a snowman, the conflict was between Jesus and Santa Claus. The two figures argued over the true meaning of Christmas, Jesus insisting it should center on his birth, Santa insisting on the commercial gift-giving tradition. And when argument failed to resolve anything, they descended into genuine, brutal, sustained violence. They beat each other senseless in the snow, while four foul-mouthed children watched and provided running commentary. Kenny got killed. Kyle was established as Jewish. The essential DNA of the entire show was right there in 5 minutes of construction paper. The writing was sharper and more confident, and there was a willingness to commit to premises all the way to their most uncomfortable conclusions that felt genuinely different from almost anything else being made anywhere at the time. Graydon sent the tape to approximately 80 friends and months in December of 1995. One of those friends was, according to persistent industry rumor that has never been definitively confirmed or denied, George Clooney, who was then in the middle of his run on ER and one of the most connected people in Hollywood. Executive producer Ann Garofino later told The Hollywood Reporter that before South Park had a network deal, before it had ever touched an airwave, the fact that tapes were already being copied and shared across Hollywood was already the stuff of industry conversation. And then the sharing extended beyond Hollywood. Someone digitized the footage and put it online, which in 1995 meant compressing a video file small enough to be transmitted over a dial-up modem in something less than a geological epoch. People shared it on floppy disks. They emailed it as attachments through systems not designed to carry files of that size. Office workers across the country were huddling around shared computer monitors, passing the screen around to show colleagues something they absolutely had to see and that they were fairly certain they shouldn't be watching at work. What they were seeing was a cartoon where Jesus punched Santa Claus, while children shouted words that were not supposed to appear in any format, on any screen, in any American workplace. It was one of the first genuinely viral videos in internet history, predating YouTube by a full decade, predating most households having reliable home broadband connections, predating the entire cultural infrastructure we now take for granted when we talk about content spreading online. It spread not through an algorithm, not through a platform, not through any system built for distribution. It spread because people couldn't stop showing it to each other. That mechanism, pure word of mouth, genuine enthusiasm, the desire to share something that made you laugh and also made you feel you probably shouldn't be laughing, is the exact mechanism that would define South Park's entire cultural life for the next 3 decades. Comedy Central executive Doug Herzog saw the buzz. He tracked down the short, watched it, and understood that something real was happening here. He commissioned Parker and Stone to develop the concept into a television series. Development was contentious from the very beginning in ways that foreshadowed everything that came after. The first focus group assembled to evaluate the pilot reportedly hated it. Their recommendation was not that it needed adjustment. Their recommendation was to throw the entire thing in the trash. Focus groups have historically been skeptical of most things that subsequently became culturally significant, so their opinion is perhaps less diagnostic than it might initially appear. But the specific virulence of the rejection, not mild disapproval but active hostility, is worth noting. Comedy Central's president of programming, Eileen Katz, had seen something the focus group had missed. She later told Variety that watching the show had given her the rare feeling that the planets were aligning around something genuinely unprecedented. A combination of elements that had never quite existed in this form before. She green-lighted the series over the focus group's objections. The kind of executive decision that either defines your career as an act of visionary courage or ends it as catastrophic misjudgment, depending entirely on what follows. What followed in this case confirmed her judgment completely. The pilot episode, Cartman Gets an Anal Probe, aired on August 13, 1997, at 10 in the evening on Comedy Central. The Nielsen rating was 1.3, translating to approximately 980,000 viewers. For cable television in 1997, that was a significant number. Comedy Central had not been generating numbers like that regularly. Something was connecting with an audience that had been waiting for something like this without knowing they were waiting. The audience kept growing. By the time the Season 1 episode Damien aired, the ratings had climbed to a 6.4. The number of households with access to Comedy Central jumped from 9.1 million in 1997 to 50 million by June of 1998. Those two numbers sit in direct relationship to each other. South Park made Comedy Central relevant in a way it had not previously been. Here's the detail about the show's origins that most people don't know, even people who have watched extensively. The pilot episode was the only episode ever made using real construction paper. Parker and Stone physically cut out pieces of paper and animated them frame by frame, exactly the way they had made the Spirit of Christmas shorts. From the second episode onward, every subsequent episode was animated digitally using computer software specifically designed to mimic the cutout paper aesthetic. The show has looked like it's made of construction paper for 28 seasons. It has not actually been made of construction paper since the single night in 1997 when everything began. That detail is worth sitting with. The entire visual identity of South Park, the jerky movements, the flat figures, the simple geometric shapes, the sense of watching something a child made with craft supplies from a school project, is entirely simulated. It is a performance of crudeness executed by sophisticated digital tools. The show that presents itself as the roughest thing on television is meticulously constructed to look rough. Parker himself has described the crude animation as a kind of permission slip that allows the audience to laugh at content that would be disturbing in a more realistic visual context. The paper cutout aesthetic creates the distance necessary for the content to function as dark comedy rather than simply as darkness. It looks like a children's program, which is part of why what it says carries such a charge. One final piece of the origin story, residing in one of the stranger corners of internet history. In 1999, 4 years after the Spirit of Christmas short was made as a Christmas card, it was discovered hidden inside the data of the video game Tiger Woods 99 for the original PlayStation. Someone at Electronic Arts had been a fan of the short, had embedded it on the game disc without anyone's authorization, and nobody had caught it before the game shipped. The file was accessible only to someone who put the game disc into a computer rather than the console, knowing to look for it. The game was rated E for everyone by the ESRB. When parents discovered that their children's golf game contained a hidden video of Jesus and Santa Claus engaged in sustained violence while children screamed profanities, Electronic Arts recalled the game in January of 1999. South Park had been hiding inside another company's product, spreading without permission, existing where it had no business existing. That story sounds like something someone made up. It isn't. And it is, in retrospect, the most fitting origin story the show could possibly have. If you're settling in for the night, drop a comment and let us know what time it is and where you're watching from. It genuinely is one of the best parts of making these. Seeing where you all are. If you haven't subscribed yet, take a second and hit that button. It helps more than you might realize. Section 2. Kenny McCormick and the Curse That Cannot End. Of all the running jokes in South Park history, Kenny dying in every episode is the one that traveled deepest into the broader culture. People who have never watched a single episode know the line. "Oh my God, they killed Kenny. You bastards." It was on t-shirts. It was referenced in other shows. It became part of everyday conversation as shorthand for sudden or absurd demise. But what most people carry in memory as a simple recurring sight gag is, when you trace the full mythology across nearly 30 years of episodes, plot threads, and carefully buried details, something considerably more intricate and considerably more melancholy than the surface presentation suggests. Start at the beginning. Kenneth McCormick lives in South Park, Colorado, with his father Stuart, who is unemployed and drinks heavily. His mother Carol works washing dishes at an Olive Garden and appears perpetually exhausted by circumstances that have been exhausting for a very long time. His older brother Kevin is largely defined by his fights with Stuart. His younger sister Karen will become important later. The family is poor in a way the show never softens. Their house is small and worn down. The furniture is old. The parents' relationship is defined by financial stress and habits that have calcified into lifestyle. Kenny navigates this environment with a cheerful pragmatism the show reserves almost exclusively for him. He doesn't perform contentment or pretend circumstances are different than they are. He simply moves through them, wearing his orange parka, going to the bus stop every morning, ready for whatever happens next. The parka is its own detail. The hood covers most of Kenny's face. His mouth is permanently obscured, his voice permanently muffled into something between speech and noise. Matt Stone provides the hooded voice by essentially mumbling under fabric, and the show maintains throughout a consistent implication that Kenny's friends can understand him even when the audience cannot. What the audience can catch, when they listen carefully enough, is frequently extremely crude. The content of Kenny's muffled speech, when you can make it out, is not appropriate for the nominal age of the character saying it. That gap between the innocent visual of a cold-weather kid bundled up for the bus stop and the actual content of what he's saying is the same structural joke that defines the show as a whole, compressed into a single recurring character design. In the first 5 seasons, Kenny died in almost every episode. The deaths were the show's most consistent creative exercise. Each required finding a new and different way to kill the same character, and the writers and animators found an extraordinary variety. He was run over by cars, buses, and steamrollers. He was shot, stabbed, and exploded. He was drowned. He was eaten by various animals and monsters. He was crushed and vaporized and decapitated. He caught diseases and fell from heights and was struck by lightning and caught fire and was dismembered by machinery. The deaths ranged from realistic to grotesque to entirely surreal, and they were performed with the same deadpan commitment the show brought to everything. Kenny's death was treated as a fact of the world, something that happened with such reliable regularity that the universe had apparently stopped registering it as unusual. The ritual response, Stan saying, "Oh my God, they killed Kenny, Kyle following with you bastards," was itself a formula that evolved. It wasn't always precisely the same phrasing. Kyle occasionally departed from the script. Sometimes the boy's reaction was more subdued. Occasionally the formula was inverted so that Kenny delivered it himself from inside the hood, reacting to someone else's misfortune. The ritual was consistent enough to be recognizable and varied enough to stay alive across 5 seasons of repetition, which is a harder balance to maintain than it sounds. Then in season 5, near the end of the season, something surprising happened. The episode Kenny Dies allowed the running joke to become something else. Kenny was diagnosed with a fatal illness, a muscular dystrophy-type condition that placed him in a hospital bed and gave the show an opportunity to treat him not as a prop for a recurring sight gag, but as a character the other boys actually cared about. Cartman cried. Not as a setup for something else, not as a joke about Cartman's self-interest being exposed. He cried because his friend was dying, and the episode held that moment with something close to genuine seriousness. Kenny died. He didn't come back the following week. Or the week after that. He stayed dead through most of season 6, his absence noted but not explained. When he finally returned at the end of season 6 in the Christmas episode Red Sleigh Down, the boys' reaction was quiet and almost casual. "Oh, hey Kenny." That was it. The show had tested the limits of the joke, set it aside when it seemed exhausted, and brought it back without making the return dramatic. It was, in its own small way, a piece of character writing. The show communicating that its relationship to Kenny's deaths had changed without explicitly saying so. From season 6 forward, the death gag appeared sporadically rather than episodically, used when the story called for it rather than as a weekly obligation. But the mythology had only just begun. The first real in-universe explanation for what had been happening all those years came in season 4's episode Cartman Joins Nambla. In a brief but striking scene, Kenny dies and his soul is shown returning to his mother. Carol McCormick becomes pregnant. She gives birth. The baby grows, rapidly, implausibly, in what appears to be a compressed version of the years that should separate infancy from being 9 years old, and is back at the bus stop, wearing the same parka, responding to the name Kenny, showing no apparent awareness that anything unusual has occurred. Stuart McCormick, watching this process, says to Carol that this must be the 50th time this has happened. She corrects him. It's the 52nd, and they move on with their day. That correction is one of the small, devastating details the show does very well. Not the 50th. The 52nd. They have been keeping count. Through all the grief and the biological labor and the impossible rapidity with which their son grows back to his previous state, they have kept an accurate tally. That precision speaks to a relationship with an impossible situation that has moved beyond horror into something that simply is. An exhausting, absurd, inescapable feature of their particular family's life. Recorded with the weary accuracy of people dealing with something they cannot change and have long since stopped trying to understand. The full canonical explanation arrived in season 14 across the 3-part story. Coon 2, Hindsight, Mysterion Rises, and Coon vs. Coon and Friends. Many of the South Park children had adopted superhero identities. Cartman had become the Coon, a raccoon-themed hero whose actual behavior tilted consistently toward villain, despite his self-image as a heroic figure. There was also a figure called Mysterion, a genuinely imposing masked hero who appeared to have actual power. Mysterion's identity had been kept deliberately obscure across multiple episodes. When it was finally revealed, it was Kenny. The scene in which Kenny, as Mysterion, explains his power to another character is one of the more genuinely affecting pieces of writing in the show's entire history. He says he cannot stay dead. He clarifies this is not a metaphor. He has died in front of his friends many times. He has experienced the afterlife, heaven, hell, sometimes apparently both, with such frequency that neither holds any novelty or meaning for him anymore. He wakes up the next morning in his bed, wearing the same clothes, and nobody around him remembers that he died. His friends don't remember. The people who watched it happen don't remember. The universe resets, and Kenny alone carries the full knowledge of what occurred, and every time he tries to tell someone, the information disappears from their memory within a day. He is completely alone with this experience. The show frames this not as a superpower, but as a curse he has been carrying since childhood, with no expectation of it ever lifting. The reason why was addressed in the same arc. During Coon vs. Coon and Friends, as Carol McCormack watches Kenny be reborn through her improbable pregnancy once again, she mutters under her breath that they should never have gone to those cult meetings. The cult was a cult of Cthulhu, worshippers of the H.P. Lovecraft cosmic horror entity, the ancient tentacled god from the sunken city of Arlaia, whose influence on Kenny was apparently set in motion before he was born. His parents had not been believers. Stuart and Carol McCormack attended those meetings because the cult provided free alcohol. That was the entire reason. The cost-benefit calculation of impoverished people looking for a free evening's entertainment accidentally exposed their unborn child to the influence of an ancient cosmic horror. And that influence is why their son has died hundreds of times and keeps coming back. That origin is simultaneously deeply funny and deeply sad in a way that feels very specific to the McCormack family and to their particular position in the world. It is not heroic. Kenny was not chosen. He was not the subject of a prophecy or the result of a deliberate act by people who understood what they were setting in motion. He exists in the state he exists in because his parent has made a practical calculation about whether to attend a social event and happened to be present at the wrong time or the right time, depending on what you think about immortality. The supernatural invaded a poor family's life not through drama or significance, but through the back door of free drinks, and then stayed permanently. There is a widely discussed fan theory that suggests Kenny's immortality affects more than just himself. The theory proposes that his constant dying and being reborn creates a kind of temporal stabilizer for the entire town, which would explain why the boys have been 9 and 10 years old for nearly 3 decades of showtime without meaningful aging. According to this theory, Kenny's rebirth cycle is generating a stasis field for the community around him, holding everyone in a kind of permanent present. The theory is not supported explicitly by any episode, and Parker and Stone have generally avoided in-universe explanations for the show's timeline logic. But it extends from established lore in a direction that makes internal sense, and the connection between a child linked to Lovecraftian cosmic horror, and a community that exists outside normal time is not entirely inconsistent with the mythology the show has built. The post-COVID specials, released in late 2021, provided the most significant expansion of Kenny's story since the Season 14 arc. In the specials, set 40 years in the future, Kenny had become wealthy, celebrated, and apparently no longer dying. He had grown from the poorest child in South Park into a scientist and philanthropist of genuine public standing, working on research into the origins of COVID and the possibility of time travel as a solution to the dystopian future the pandemic had produced. He died of a new COVID variant, but this death was permanent, in a way his childhood deaths never were. His mother, by the time of the specials, would have been in her mid to late 60s. past the point where the biological mechanism of his rebirth cycle could function. At some point in the decades between the show's present and the special's future, without ceremony or acknowledgement, Kenny simply had to start surviving. He outlasted his own curse. The mechanism that had defined his existence since childhood ended not through any dramatic intervention, but through the simple passage of time. Karen McCormick, Kenny's younger sister, adds one more quiet dimension to his story. In later seasons, it was established that Kenny, as Mysterion, watches over Karen. She tells people she sees a guardian angel, a figure who appears to her when she's frightened, who seems to keep danger at a distance, who makes her feel protected. That figure is Mysterion, her brother who cannot die, who has been to heaven and hell more times than he can count, who wakes up alone every morning carrying memories nobody else retains, has devoted some portion of his immortal existence to making sure his little sister feels safe. It is the most unexpectedly tender thing in his entire story, and it is almost entirely wordless. Section 3. Butters Stotch. From background kid to the heart of the show, Leopold Stotch has a voice that Matt Stone created by doing an impression of a real person. That person is Eric Stowe, the director of animation on South Park for many years, who apparently speaks with a slight stutter, soft southern cadence, and a high vocal register that Stone found perfectly suited to a character who would become one of the show's most beloved. Butters, whose nickname derives loosely from a shortened version of Stowe's own nickname among the production crew, did not begin as a character at all. He was flat, round-headed background furniture. A blonde kid in a turquoise jacket who appeared in crowd scenes during Season 1 without a name, without a line, without any narrative purpose except filling out the visual suggestion of a full classroom. His first speaking line came in Season 2, in an episode called Clubhouses, where he passed a note from BB to the boys. He was a note carrier, a piece of staging that happened to briefly move and speak. Nobody watching that scene would have predicted that this background figure would become so central to the show that Trey Parker would describe him as arguably the character who most consistently represents South Park's emotional core. The name itself didn't fully stabilize until Season 3. In the episode Two Guys Naked in a Hot Tub, Stan referred to him as Butter rather than Butters, singular, without the final consonant, as if the show wasn't yet completely sure how to address him. The name became standard gradually through repetition, the way names in real communities settle into their final form through use rather than decision. The transformation from background figure to genuine character happened when Kenny died at the end of Season 5. Without their fourth friend, the boys needed someone to fill the role. They selected Butters, who was immediately and visibly delighted to be included in a way that established everything important about his character in a single emotional beat. He didn't know he was a stopgap, a placeholder, a temporary solution while the writers figured out what to do with the Kenny problem. He knew only that the boys had asked him to be part of their group, and that this was wonderful, and that he was going to do his absolute best. The relationship between Butters and Cartman that developed during Season 6 and deepened across subsequent years is one of the show's stranger recurring dynamics. Cartman recognized immediately what made Butters exploitable, and it was not stupidity. Butters was not stupid, though he was naive in very specific and consistent ways. What he was, at a fundamental level, was someone who operated from a baseline assumption of good faith. He believed that when someone said they were his friend, they meant it. He believed that when someone said they needed his help, the need was genuine. In a world where almost every other character operated from assumptions of self-interest and competition, Butters' default trust was practically unique, which made him, from Cartman's perspective, practically infinitely usable. The Stotch household is one of the show's stranger recurring environments. Stephen and Linda Stotch are Butters' parents, and they are, in their own particular way, a sustained study in the damage that ordinary people can inflict on their children without any dramatic intent or awareness of what they're doing. Stephen grounds Butters constantly, reflexively, compulsively, as a response to any situation that becomes unclear or uncomfortable. Butters is grounded for things that aren't his fault. He is grounded for things that are the direct result of other people's choices. He is grounded for things entirely beyond his control. Stephen Stotch's relationship with the punishment of grounding appears to be less a parenting strategy than an exercise of authority for its own sake, an assertion of control over a son who is relentlessly kind in a household that does not know what to do with kindness. The episode Butter's Very Own Episode from December of 2001 was the moment the character became something real. In that episode, Butters discovers that his father has been secretly visiting gay bathhouses. He tells his mother, Linda, who already knows and who responds to this knowledge by attempting to drown Butters in a car she pushes into a lake. She chooses her son as the object of the violence that her husband's secret has generated in her. Butters escapes. He wanders home. When he arrives, his parents frame his absence as a disappearance they had been anxiously reporting to police and media. The episode ends with Butters apologizing to his parents for causing them stress. He apologizes to the people who just tried to kill him. He does it reflexively, automatically, without any apparent awareness of the irony, because he has been trained through years of disproportionate punishment for things he didn't do to default to apology as a first response to any adult displeasure. The groundings have done their work. He experiences himself as the source of problems rather than the recipient of them, which means that even when the truth is directly the opposite, his emotional framework interprets events through the lens of his own culpability. Professor Chaos came out of rejection. When the boys decided partway through Season 6 that Butters wasn't quite what they needed in a fourth friend, they ran a selection process that was itself a small act of cruelty dressed up as a game. Butters was dismissed. His response was to construct an alter ego. He made a costume from aluminum foil, a FAP, a helmet, gauntlets, and declared himself Professor Chaos, agent of anarchy, enemy of the world that had wronged him. He would bring disorder to everything. He would make the world feel what he felt. His first act of chaos was stealing the erasers from the classroom chalkboard. That is the entirety of his opening villainy. Eraser theft. The gap between the grandeur of the title, Professor Chaos, Bringer of Anarchy, and the actual scale of his crimes is the joke. But it is a joke that also captures something true about how children process powerlessness. When the people who have dismissed you are larger and more confident than you feel, you construct an internal mythology of threat that compensates for the external reality. Professor Chaos exists because Butters needed somewhere for the anger to go. That it goes into aluminum foil and eraser theft rather than anything genuinely destructive is entirely consistent with who he is. Even his villainy is fundamentally harmless. Butters' birthday, revealed in the episode Awesome O, is September 11th. This is presented as a throwaway piece of information, mentioned briefly and never returned to. It simply exists in the background of the show's official character data, available to anyone who looks closely enough. The date carries enormous cultural weight for an American audience, particularly for any episode produced in the years following 2001. Whether Parker and Stone chose it deliberately as a piece of dark irony attached to the show's most innocent character, or whether the writers selected a random date without the full weight of September 11th being at the forefront of their minds is unclear. The creators have never specifically addressed it. The ambiguity is permanent. The Imagination Land trilogy gave Butters his most heroic arc. Stranded in a dimension existing inside humanity's collective imagination, declared by Aslan the Lion to be the chosen one, the only being with the imaginative power and purity of spirit to restore balance to a world under siege. Butters spent most of 2 episodes primarily concerned with whether he was going to be grounded when he finally got home. His parents didn't know where he was. He was going to be in so much trouble. The universe needed him to imagine with focused conviction, powerful enough to reshape reality, and he was preoccupied with the domestic consequences he would face from Stephen Stotch. That tension between the cosmic scale of what was being asked of him and the hyper-local scale of what was actually worrying him is the most South Park version of Butters possible. He was the chosen one. He was also a child terrified of being grounded. Both were equally true and equally present in every scene. The world was saved. He was grounded anyway. Somewhere in that refusal to let the heroism override the domestic reality, is one of the most honest observations the show has ever made about being a child. The question of why Butters specifically has the imaginative power required to serve as the chosen one, why his mind is what Aslan identifies as the most pure and most potent, is never fully explained in the episodes themselves, but the answer exists in everything the show had established about him before the trilogy aired. Butters is not cynical. He is the only character in the show's central cast who has not had his capacity for wonder, for genuine enthusiasm, for the unguarded forward motion toward things that interest him, worn down by the accumulated experience of living in South Park. He has been lied to, manipulated, punished unjustly, and used as a prop in other people's stories for years, and none of it has produced in him the protective armor of irony that every other character wears by approximately season 3. He still believes things. He still hopes for things. He still approaches the world as if it might, on any given day, turn out to be wonderful. This is why he can do what the trilogy requires of him. Imagination Land needs imagination, and imagination, at the level that can reshape a dimension, requires the specific quality of being genuinely, undefensively open to possibility. Cartman cannot do it. His imagination is vivid but targeted and cruel, bent toward specific outcomes that serve his own interests. Stan cannot do it. His empathy is real, but frequently paralyzed by the weight of what he understands. Haile cannot do it. His moral seriousness makes his imagination an instrument of argument rather than of creation. Butters can do it because nothing has convinced him yet that hoping doesn't work. He has had abundant reason to arrive at that conclusion. He has not. The graduation scene that closed one of the later specials showed Butters in a context that briefly let the character exist outside the role he normally occupies. He was there. He was present in a way that suggested someone who had navigated his specific difficulties without being destroyed by them. The show has never given Butters a tidy resolution to the questions his character raises, and it shouldn't. The conditions that produced him, the household, the groundings, the default apologizing, have not changed. He continues to exist inside them with the impossible resilience of someone whose kindness is not a strategy or a performance, but simply what he is, continuously, without apparent effort, in a world that does not especially reward it. That quality, more than anything else, is probably why he became the character Parker identifies as the show's emotional center. In a show full of people performing cynicism at various volumes, Butters keeps being sincere. In a show where the consistent satirical move is to reveal the self-interest beneath apparent good intentions, Butters keeps having actual good intentions. He is the character who costs the show's comedy the least and gives it the most, because his sincerity is the measure against which everything else's cynicism is calibrated. Without him, the darkness has no contrast. He is, in the technical sense, the light source. Section 4, Mr. Hat, Mr. Garrison, and the Puppet. With a life of its own, Herbert Garrison is the soap opera element of South Park. That's how Trey Parker has described him in various interviews across the show's run, and the description is precise. Of all the recurring adult characters in the town, Garrison is the one whose arc across 28 seasons most closely resembles what you'd find in a serialized drama. A continuous story of identity, denial, transformation, and the long process of becoming who you actually are even when who you actually are turns out to be genuinely alarming. And at the center of the earliest chapters of that story, present from the pilot through the first 6 seasons, and then reappearing in crucial moments ever since, is a puppet named Mr. Hat. Mr. Hat is a small hand puppet that Garrison wore on his hand at all times during his years as a classroom teacher. He conducted actual lessons through the puppet. He carried on full conversations with it, blaming it when anything inappropriate was said in class, treating it as a separate and fully autonomous being. The children in his class found this unsettling. The audience found it unsettling. Both were right to. The show presented the dynamic as obviously aberrant without initially providing any framework for understanding exactly what was happening. That framework arrived in Season 2, when Garrison temporarily lost the puppet and sought professional help. A therapist delivered a direct summary. Mr. Hat was Garrison's gay side trying to come out. Garrison was a closeted homosexual in profound denial. And he had externalized his repressed identity into a puppet because externalizing it allowed him to disown it. When Mr. Hat said something homosexual or racist or aggressive, Garrison could honestly say that Mr. Hat had done that, not him. The puppet carried the weight of everything Garrison couldn't acknowledge about himself. This explanation is psychologically coherent and maps cleanly onto most of Mr. Hat's behavior in the early seasons. But then there are the other appearances, the ones that don't fit any psychological framework, the ones where Mr. Hat does things that would be physically impossible for a small puppet on a man's hand. In the Season 2 episode Summer Sucks, Mr. Hat goes missing after an argument with Garrison. He later turns up in a sauna with Brett Favre. He is shown blinking independently, looking at Favre without anyone holding him. Favre treats him as an actual social companion, greeting him warmly, apparently having a perfectly comfortable time in the sauna with a puppet that arrived without an owner. Mr. Hat in a room he could not have reached on his own, conducting an interaction he could not have initiated on his own, behaving with apparent full autonomy. In the Season 2 episode Chef Aid, after Garrison and Chef are arrested and locked in a jail cell, Mr. Hat executes a jailbreak. He somehow attaches a chain from the jail window bars to an SUV parked outside, then drives the SUV to yank the window out of the cell wall. Chef's immediate reaction was to wonder how Mr. Hat reached the pedals. Not whether Mr. Hat could operate a vehicle, not whether a puppet could manage a steering wheel or any of the car's other controls. Just the height question. Chef accepted the impossible premise entirely and went straight to the specific practical incongruity, which is the show's standard approach to impossible things. Acknowledge one specific physical detail while accepting the larger impossibility without question, then move on. In the episode Chef Goes Nanners, Garrison explicitly states he won't attend a KKK rally with Mr. Hat, saying this while Mr. Hat is on his hand, which technically means he is talking to his own fist. And then Mr. Hat simply disappears off his hand and turns up at the rally on his own. He attends the meeting, he participates, he returns. No explanation is offered for how or why this happened. There is also the documented Vietnam War connection. The official South Park character materials describe Mr. Hat as having served alongside a figure called Mitch Connor during the Vietnam War before becoming associated with a young Herbert Garrison. This would make Mr. Hat considerably older than he appears, a veteran of a conflict that ended in 1975, in existence for at least 22 years before the pilot aired in 1997. What he was doing in the gap between Vietnam and appearing on a classroom teacher's hand in Colorado is not addressed. The biography simply contains that gap, unexplained. Parker has said that Garrison is the character he finds most interesting to write because the Garrison story is genuinely serialized in a way that most South Park characters aren't. Garrison was closeted, then came out, underwent a sex change in Season 9, detransitioned in Season 12, became a Trump parody running for and winning the presidency in Season 20, and in the most recent seasons exists in a post-presidential state whose psychological complexity the show continues to explore. Each phase built on the previous ones. Mr. Hat's last significant appearance was in the Season 20, Episode 200, when Garrison was pressured by Cartman to retrieve the old puppet from storage. Garrison resisted initially, saying he didn't need Mr. Hat anymore. But as the conversation pressed on him in ways that resonated with old anxieties, something happened. The voice changed slightly. The posture shifted. He began engaging with Mr. Hat in a way that looked less like a conscious decision to revisit an old habit and more like someone sliding back into an earlier version of themselves, as if pulling on a coat they thought they'd gotten rid of, but found still fitting perfectly. The show has never resolved whether Mr. Hat is purely a projection of Garrison's unconscious, a genuine supernatural entity using Garrison as an anchor point, or something that exists in the deliberately maintained ambiguity between those two possibilities. That ambiguity is the point. A definitive answer would make Mr. Hat smaller than the mystery around him, and the mystery is more interesting than any answer could be. Mr. Hat is currently, according to the most recent canonical lore, residing inside Mr. Slave's rectum. As final destinations for a character with a history stretching from the Vietnam War to a KKK rally to a sauna with Brett Favre to a jailbreak, It is an ending that is quiet and unglamorous and very South Park. Mr. Slave deserves more than a passing mention in any serious accounting of South Park's character history, because he is one of the more surprising, genuine evolutions in the show's 28 seasons. He arrived in Season 7 as a crude joke, a leather-clad bondage partner for a newly out Garrison, part of the show's typical approach to new character introductions, which involves presenting a single defining trait at maximum volume before discovering whether there is anything underneath. The defining trait was explicit. Mr. Slave was a submissive partner, whose most famous moment involved Paris Hilton disappearing entirely inside him during an episode about celebrity culture and disposable fame. He was a visual gag deployed for shock value, and then he kept coming back. He became a recurring presence in the school environment after Garrison left teaching, and the recurring presence accumulated texture. He became a genuine community member, visible at town meetings, part of the background social fabric of South Park in a way that slowly separated him from the single-note introduction. He married Big Gay Al in Season 12, the first gay marriage in the show's universe, in an episode that positioned the event as an actual occasion rather than as a punchline. His relationship with Mr. Hat's final location is one of the show's quieter callbacks, connecting his earliest appearance to a character whose history predates almost everything else in the mythology. What makes the Garrison arc so remarkable when examined as a continuous narrative across 20-plus seasons is how it refuses to let any single version of the character be definitive. The closeted Garrison, the out Garrison, the post-transition Garrison, the detransitioned Garrison, the presidential candidate Garrison, the post-presidential Garrison. Each iteration is presented as genuine rather than as a disguise over some truer self beneath. The show's implicit argument about identity, expressed over decades of storytelling, is that people do not contain a fixed true self waiting to be uncovered. They contain accumulated experience, contradictory drives, and the ongoing process of trying to reconcile both into something they can live with. Garrison has never successfully completed that reconciliation. It is an ongoing project. The show treats this not as failure, but as evidence that he is alive. Parker has said in interviews that writing Garrison requires him to consistently resist the temptation to simplify. The character is genuinely complicated in ways that don't resolve into easy lessons about identity or politics or how people change over time. The Trump period of Garrison's arc, in which he ran for and won the presidency as a thinly veiled stand-in for Donald Trump, and then spent multiple seasons in the actual White House apparently horrified by what he was doing while continuing to do it, managed to be simultaneously a piece of political commentary and a continuation of Garrison's very personal decades-long story. He was not just a vehicle for satire. He was a confused person who had ended up somewhere he hadn't fully intended to be, which described the character before the politics and would describe him again after they were no longer the central focus. The relationship between Garrison and his classroom over the early seasons is worth sitting with separately from the Mr. Hat questions. He was a terrible teacher by any measurable standard. He was offensive, distracted, frequently wrong about the subject matter he was supposed to be conveying, and prone to inserting his own emotional preoccupations into lessons without any pretense of relevance. The children absorbed this for years, with the resigned acceptance of people who have learned that adults in authority positions are often not performing their official function, and that pointing this out is generally more trouble than it is worth. The children of South Park Elementary have always had a clearer understanding of adult dysfunction than the adults do. Garrison's classroom simply provided a very specific kind of education, not in the subject matter on the board, but in how complicated and often self-defeating people can be at any age. The substitute teachers who occasionally replaced Garrison deserve their own footnote. Mr. Substitute, who appeared during one of Garrison's various absences, was beloved by the students in a way that implicitly indicted everything about their actual teacher by contrast. The substitute was kind and competent, interested in the children as individual people. The children responded with the enthusiasm of people who have been given, briefly, a glimpse of what the thing they receive a bad version of every day could feel like when it functions properly. And then Garrison returned, and the glimpse ended, and education in South Park reverted to its ambient state. Section 5, The Hidden Visitors. South Park's greatest ongoing Easter egg. There is a belief widely circulating through the South Park fan community with the persistence of things that are almost true and satisfying enough to repeat without verifying, that a gray alien is hidden somewhere in every single episode of the show. This claim has been stated as fact in countless articles, repeated in fan forums, cited in videos with the certainty of something that doesn't require checking because everyone already knows it. It has become, in the way of show mythology, canonical and cultural memory, even though the show itself has explicitly said otherwise. The belief is wrong, but the actual truth is stranger and more interesting. The aliens, called visitors in official South Park materials, referred to in fan communities as Greys, designated within the show's canonical mythology as beings from somewhere specific with an agenda that has nothing to do with invasion. First appeared as actual characters in the pilot episode, Cartman Gets an Anal Probe. The premise was that aliens had abducted Cartman the previous night and inserted a satellite dish into his digestive system. By the end of the episode, they departed having accomplished their purpose, and the question of whether they would return was left open. What happened next was that Eric Stowe, the director of animation, the real person after whom Butters was named, began hiding tiny versions of these alien figures in episode backgrounds. Not according to any schedule or rule or formal decision. Stowe found it amusing, and he kept doing it in the way that small personal creative practices sometimes persist across years of work, accumulating into a tradition through the simple act of continuing. The aliens appeared in varied forms and at varied levels of concealment. Sometimes they were reasonably visible in crowd scenes. Sometimes they were extraordinarily subtle, outlines in shadow, shapes suggested by architecture, figures that required pausing and zooming to identify. In some episodes, an alien was driving a vehicle. In others, one was attending a public meeting wearing a wig and attempting to blend with the human characters. In at least one memorable appearance, a group of visitors turned up at a beauty pageant in drag. South Park Studios addressed the question directly multiple times. In 2002, the official FAQ stated that aliens appeared in over half of all episodes, that Stowe usually inserted them at the last minute if he remembered to, and that he didn't keep track. This is, when you consider it, a surprisingly casual account of something that has become central to the show's fan culture. An animation director adding hidden figures to episodes on an as-he-felt-like-it basis, keeping no records, following no master plan. The tradition exists because one person kept doing a thing he enjoyed doing. A subsequent FAQ response was direct. Not every episode. Some episodes frequently, but not every one. The myth persists despite the official correction, probably because a near-universal presence is more narratively satisfying than a sporadic one. The human mind wants the rule to be clean and the pattern to be consistent. When the actual pattern is messier and more human scale than the legend wins in cultural memory. The episode became controversial through no fault of its own, simply by existing in a changed world. And that's something I think a lot of people don't appreciate about South Park's controversy history. The show doesn't just generate new controversies, it retroactively generates old ones. The specific physical appearance of the visitors has remained consistent enough across hundreds of episodes that fans have developed detailed identification guides. The standard visitor is gray, roughly humanoid, large-headed in proportion to the body, with an elongated skull and the oversized dark eyes that characterize the classic pop culture gray alien design. They appear in varying sizes. Some are shown at what appears to be full adult scale. Others seem smaller, possibly juvenile, or simply scaled down to fit into tighter background positions without overwhelming the scene. They have been spotted in single frames that only freeze framing can reveal, and they have been spotted in positions that would require a casual viewer to be actively scanning the background rather than following the foreground action. The community of people who track visitor appearances has maintained consistent documentation across all 28 seasons. They share screenshots, timestamp findings, debate whether a given background gray figure is definitively a visitor or simply an ambiguous shape in a crowd. There is genuine methodological disagreement within the community about what counts, whether only the classic full-body gray alien design qualifies, or whether partial glimpses and obscured figures should also be noted. The documentation project has never been completed because new episodes continue to appear, each one potentially containing new sightings that need to be cataloged and cross-referenced. Eric Stowe, the animation director whose real voice inspired Butter's speaking cadence, was the person who began inserting the visitors into episodes. He has confirmed in interviews that he added them when he thought of it, when there was time, when the scene had a background that seemed to accommodate one. He wasn't following a production mandate or satisfying a showrunner's specific request. He was doing something he found personally amusing and that the team had come to regard as a tradition worth maintaining. There was no formal policy, there was no master schedule of which episodes would contain visitors and which would not. There was one animator who liked the joke and kept doing it. This is the production reality underneath the mythology, a tradition that feels like it might have enormous deliberate significance that has inspired thousands of hours of fan investigation and documentation, was maintained by one person exercising personal creative preference on an episode-by-episode basis without records. The fans have built something much more systematic around a practice that was never systematic at all. The gap between what the audience constructed and what was actually happening is itself a small comedy about how meaning is made. The canceled episode that revealed the Earth as television production mythology managed something genuinely difficult. It provided a canonical in-universe explanation for the visitors that was both absurdist and internally coherent. The logic was airtight once the premise was accepted. Of course the aliens kept appearing. The show they were producing was still running. Of course they showed up in crowd scenes and community events. Those were the locations where the content was being generated. Of course they looked like they were trying not to be noticed. They were working. They did not want to interrupt the shoot. The satellite dish installation mythology, the canonical explanation for every anal probing in the show's history, up to and including the one in the pilot episode that gave that episode its title, transformed what appeared to be shock comedy into infrastructure. The bodies of South Park's human characters were carrying Nerzud Productions broadcast equipment. They had been carrying it since the beginning of the recorded history the show had established. The probing was installation work. It was cable. Every moment that seemed like pure transgressive humor was actually, by retroactive canonical logic, a piece of technical maintenance on a broadcast network that had been running since before recorded human civilization. The joke that this creates is multi-layered in a way that rewards the more you think about it. Earth as television program means that the audience watching South Park on their screens, the actual human beings in the actual world, are watching a show about characters who are themselves unwitting performers in a show. The humans in South Park are the cast who don't know they're the cast. The humans watching South Park are the external audience watching the cast who don't know they're the cast. And somewhere in the mythology, Nerzud Productions' actual audience is watching all of it from a remove that makes the human viewing experience a meta layer in a larger broadcast structure. The recursive quality of this, the way the show positioned its own audience as part of the cosmological joke, is one of the cleverest pieces of structural self-awareness in the show's history. Section 6. Imagination Land and the Woodland Critters, Cartman's Darkest Creations. In December of 2004, South Park aired a Christmas episode that has never quite been filed away in the memory of anyone who saw it. Woodland Critter Christmas was a Season 8 episode constructed around an extended formal trick. It was framed as a story Eric Cartman was narrating for a school assignment. A Christmas tale in the tradition of children's holiday specials. The narration was warm and literary. The visual style deployed soft colors and seasonal charm. The animals were adorable, round-eyed, cheerful-voiced, talking in the eager, exclamatory way of characters designed for young viewers. The episode invited you to settle into something comforting. And then it kept going. The 12 Woodland Critters. Squirrely the squirrel, Barry the bear, Deary the deer, Rabbity the rabbit, Beavery the beaver, Porcupiney the porcupine, Skunky the skunk, Foxy the fox, Mousy the mouse, Raccoony the raccoon, Woodpeckery the woodpecker, and Chickadee the chickadee, each with a small verbal tick or catchphrase, were waiting for the birth of their savior. They had built a Christmas tree and needed a star placed on top of it. They needed a boy named Stan who had wandered into Cartman's story as its protagonist to help with various tasks. They called him Stanny, with an affection that felt genuine and sweet. Stan helped. He placed the star. He killed a mountain lion that was threatening the critter's safety. He genuinely tried to be the decent protagonist a Christmas story requires. And then the episode revealed what the critters actually were. They worshiped Satan. The savior they were waiting for was an antichrist, a being whose birth would allow Satan to rule the world. They conducted blood orgies. They described ritual sacrifice with the same cheerful matter-of-factness they used for everything else, switching without transition from holiday warmth to satanic practice with the ease of entities for whom both occupied the same emotional category. Porcupiney was pregnant with the Antichrist. Tianha, because he was Jewish, was identified as the ideal host. Kade contracted AIDS when the entity entered him. Santa Claus eventually arrived with a shotgun and killed all 12 critters methodically, one by one, in the snow. The episode ended with Cartman's narration completing the story with the same warm tone he'd used at the start. He had been in control of everything. The critters were his characters, invented for the assignment, and the story went exactly where he wanted it to go. As a window into what Cartman's imagination produces when left completely unconstrained, what he finds satisfying, what he considers a good Christmas story, but the episode is one of the most disturbing things the show has ever produced. The critters are innocent-looking and absolutely evil because Cartman made them that way, because that particular combination is, for him, the ideal form of entertainment. 3 years later, in Season 11's 3-part Imagination Land event, the critters returned. Not as characters in another of Cartman's stories, as actual residents of a real place. Imagination Land is the dimension where all of humanity's imaginary creations have their existence. Every character ever written, drawn, dreamed, or invented lives there, a vast parallel world populated by the full spectrum of human creative output. The good imaginary characters live in a bright storybook half. Aslan, the Care Bears, Luke Skywalker, various fairy tale figures, the residents of stories made with love and optimism. The evil characters live on the other side of a barrier. When terrorists attacked Imagination Land and destroyed the barrier, the evil characters poured through. The hierarchy among them was immediately contested. Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, and various other imaginary villains couldn't agree on who should lead. They argued. They failed to organize. And then the woodland critters arrived. The critters showed up having apparently made the journey from wherever they'd been held without incident, and immediately assumed a leadership role not through argument or intimidation, but through the mechanism of being more disturbing than anyone else present. When the gathered evil characters discussed what to do with captured strawberry shortcake, the woodland critters' suggestions were so specific and extreme that the other villains, entities who existed because the human imagination placed them in the category of things that frighten us, were genuinely shocked. Jason Voorhees stated that he did not want to meet the kid who had dreamed those things up. A fictional serial killer describing Cartman's creations as beyond even his comfort zone. It is a remarkable piece of recursive horror commentary, delivered with complete deadpan. The critters proceeded to assault Kurt Russell and his squad of soldiers. The government had sent Kurt Russell into Imagination Land because he had appeared in the film Stargate, providing relevant portal experience. What the critters did to them was shown entirely off-screen, with only sound audible, which was either a production choice or an acknowledgement that even South Park didn't want to depict this directly. They later attacked Popeye in the final battle. They proposed specific methods of torture for strawberry shortcake that disturbed even Freddy Krueger. Butters was declared the chosen one by Aslan and spent most of 2 episodes trying to figure out what that meant, while primarily worrying about being grounded when he got home. The world was saved through his imaginative capacity. He was grounded anyway. The Imagination Land trilogy won an Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program for programming 1 hour or more in 2008. The first time South Park had been nominated in that category and the only time it has won it. The same episodes that featured Cartman's satanic animal creations, assaulting soldiers and cartoon characters, won the television industry's most prestigious animation honor. The full roster of heroic imaginary characters present in Imagination Land represents one of the more quietly impressive acts of fictional archiving the show has attempted. Alongside the familiar figures, Aslan, Luke Skywalker, Gandalf, Santa Claus, Jesus, were characters from more obscure cultural corners. The Lollipop King, a gentle figure drawn from a visual tradition of candy-based fantasy that the show treated with the same dignity as the more famous residents. Morpheus from the Matrix films. Cinderella, though her presence in the embattled heroic half of Imagination Land raised philosophical questions about the internal consistency of the universe's good-evil sorting mechanism that the show's pace didn't allow time to address. The lion from the Chronicles of Narnia stood at the center of the resistance because Aslan was, apparently, the most powerful good imaginary being in existence, which in a direct confrontation with an army of evil imaginary characters that included Cartman's demonic woodland creatures was not sufficient. The terrorists who attacked Imagination Land in the opening episode are worth examining in their own right, because they represent a piece of 2007 political commentary delivered through fantasy metaphor. The show depicted international terrorists breaching the most protected and innocent place in the universe, a dimension composed entirely of human imagination, as a way of articulating something about the nature of the early 2000s security anxiety and what it had done to the concept of safety. Nowhere was safe. Even a place that existed inside the imagination of humanity could be attacked, because the humans who imagined it had also imagined terrorism and threat, and you could not have one without the other. The evil half of Imagination Land existed because humans imagined evil. The boundary was always going to fail eventually. The government's response to the Imagination Land breach, sending Kurt Russell because he had appeared in Stargate, deploying the U.S. military into a dimension of imagination, treating imaginary casualties with the same procedural seriousness they'd bring to a real geopolitical incident, is a joke that works precisely because the bureaucratic logic is internally consistent. If Imagination Land were real, this is exactly how the government would respond. The same apparatus, the same procedures, the same chain of command. Reality had always been the assumption underneath the comedy. Kyle's legal situation across the trilogy runs parallel to the world-ending crisis and is, in South Park's way of keeping multiple scales of concern alive simultaneously, treated with equal weight. Cartman had bet Kyle that leprechauns were real. Kyle lost. As payment, Cartman was legally entitled to have Kyle perform a specific sexual act. The legal proceedings continued in precise parallel with the war to save imagination itself, each development in the cosmic battle matched by a corresponding development in the small claims dispute. Kyle's attorney tried to argue irrelevance given the scale of current events. The case continued anyway. When the Tribunal of Imaginary Beings required Kyle to enter Imagination Land to serve as the chosen mind whose imaginative power could restore reality, the unresolved legal obligation was still pending on the docket. The universe nearly ended. Cartman collected his payment. Both things mattered. Both things were handled with complete procedural seriousness. The woodland critter's place in Cartman's psychology has never been directly analyzed by the show's other characters, which is consistent with how the show handles its most disturbing implications generally. The characters of South Park mostly do not sit with the full weight of what Cartman has done and continues to do. They move through it and around it and occasionally directly into it, but they rarely stop and examine it from outside. That examination is left to the audience, who have been given, across 20-plus seasons, enough material to form their own conclusions about what it means that the most popular character in a show watched by millions of people is someone who arranged for a teenager to eat his own parents in chili, and whose unguided creative imagination produces satanic woodland creatures who run blood orgies and disturb Jason Voorhees. The critters' names all follow the same construction, animal noun plus the suffix y, and they use first-person plural consistently when speaking, as if the group functions as a collective identity rather than as a set of individuals. This syntactic habit is one small piece of evidence for the reading of the critters as an externalization of Cartman's own psychological material. A single dark imaginative voice distributed across 12 adorable bodies, each one carrying a piece of the whole rather than existing as a separate self. They finish each other's sentences. Their enthusiasm is identical across all 12 of them. They are 12 different faces wearing the same expression. The recurring presence of Satanism as a thread in Cartman's creative output, the woodland critters, various plots that involved Satan directly, the general ease with which Cartman invokes themes of dark power and corruption, connects to a broader pattern in the show's mythology that positions hell as a functional place with its own social dynamics, its own interpersonal dramas, its own bureaucratic frustrations. Satan is a recurring character in South Park, not as a symbol of abstract evil, but as a specific entity with emotional needs, relationship problems, genuine sadness, and a tendency to be manipulated by the people he trusts. He has been, at various points, more sympathetic than most of the human characters. The darkness in South Park's mythology is never pure. It is personal and specific, and often more recognizable than the things the show depicts as good. Section 7, Randy Marsh, The Long Strange Trip. From geologist to marijuana farmer. Randy Marsh began as a background parent. He was Stan's dad. He appeared at the edges of stories involving his son, providing adult perspective on elementary school crises, embarrassing Stan at community events with a cheerful obliviousness to the embarrassment he was causing, delivering exposition when the plot required a parent to do so. His design was simple. He seemed fine. He seemed harmless. The kind of TV dad who would never become a main character because there was nothing particularly interesting about him. That impression was wrong in ways that took several seasons to become apparent. Randy's first name comes directly from Trey Parker's own father, who was also named Randy and who was also a geologist. The fictional Randy Marsh works at the South Park Center for Seismic Activity, monitoring earthquake data, a profession Parker selected specifically because of the biographical connection. Parker has described his real father as the inspiration for Randy's defining quality, the complete inability to calibrate his emotional response to match the actual scale of a situation. His father had, Parker noted, a tendency to respond to minor inconveniences with the same intensity he brought to genuine crises, and to approach serious situations with the casualness he normally reserved for trivial ones. This mismatch between event and response, the emotional volume knob that is either off or at maximum with nothing in between, became the engine of Randy Marsh's comedy. The early Randy appeared primarily in crowd and background scenes, occasionally given a reaction shot or a line, reliably embarrassing in ways the show kept understated. It wasn't until the middle seasons that the writers recognized what they had in the character and began letting him drive stories rather than just react to them. When Randy became the subject of an episode rather than the background of one, something clicked. His specific brand of passionate, conviction-driven, completely wrong enthusiasm turned out to be a comedic engine that could power almost any premise. He said the N-word on a game show in Season 11's With Apologies to Jesse Jackson, triggering a racial controversy in the town that the episode handled with more nuance than its premise suggested. He became obsessed with cooking shows and took over the school cafeteria as an amateur celebrity chef. He performed as the recording artist Lorde across multiple seasons, a fact that required Parker to actually record music in Lorde's style, and the show to maintain with complete seriousness the premise that a middle-aged Colorado geologist was secretly one of the most successful pop artists of the era. His family was apparently aware of the Lorde situation and had chosen not to address it publicly, which is the kind of family accommodation of an obvious problem that the show depicts with particular accuracy. The Tegrity Farms era began in Season 22's fourth episode, October 2018. Cannabis had been legalized in Colorado, and the cultural conversation around legal marijuana was at the specific pitch of simultaneous enthusiasm and hand-wringing that Parker and Stone found irresistible as material. Randy's response was to move the entire Marsh family onto a hemp farm in the countryside, which he named Tegrity Farms, a portmanteau of integrity and the informal name for the state, with the specific implication that Randy's version of integrity was one he got to define for himself. He partnered with Towley, the sentient towel who had been a recurring character since Season 6, whose primary qualification for cannabis quality control was self-evident. The Tegrity era became the most sustained narrative commitment the show had made since the major Cartman storylines of the middle seasons. The show replaced its opening sequence with a custom Tegrity Farms version for the first 6 episodes of Season 23. Randy drove plots across multiple seasons, multiple pandemic specials, and multiple Paramount Plus streaming films. His cannabis business grew increasingly unethical. Deals with the Chinese government to sell into a market where the product was being used to frame student protesters. Prison time in China, including imprisonment alongside Winnie the Pooh, cocaine as a winter agricultural crop, physical violence against competitors with a personal quality that exceeded what the situation called for. The distinction between the Randy who had previously cared about his community and family, imperfectly, foolishly, but genuinely, and the Randy the show sometimes called Karen, the selfish and entitled identity that the Tegrity business had either created or revealed, became the central ongoing tension of the arc. The post-COVID specials gave those years their full weight. In the dystopian future bad timeline, Stan had burned down the Tegrity Farms barn in a moment of genuine rupture, not knowing that Randy had locked Shelley inside as punishment for refusing to do farm work. Shelley died in the fire. Sharon, destroyed by her daughter's death, took her own life. The Marsh family that existed in the show's present was, in the worst version of the future, entirely gone. Stan and Randy estranged, Sharon dead, Shelley dead. The cannabis farm, running joke of multiple seasons, had been paid for in full in that timeline. The arc ended in season 27's Sicko Fancy, when ICE agents arrested Randy's workers, and Sharon sold the farm while Randy was occupied with AI consultation and ketamine microdosing experiments conducted with Towley. The decision was made without consulting him. He didn't fight it. 7 years and multiple specials after the move to Tegrity Farms, the Marsh family moved back to South Park. Randy returned to geology. The era was over. The return to geology is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reframes the entire Tegrity Farms arc in a way that is quietly melancholy. Randy Marsh was, before the cannabis business, a seismic activity monitor. He watched instruments that detected movement in the earth, subtle shifts in ground that most people would never notice and that had no visible consequence in daily life. The job was important in the way that most important jobs are, invisibly, consistently, without drama or public acknowledgement. He was good at it. He had a career. He had professional competence that expressed itself in quiet expertise rather than in the performance of passion. The Tegrity era was the opposite of that in almost every respect. It was loud. It was visible. It generated drama constantly. It required Randy to define himself through a product and a brand rather than through work. And the distinction between those two things is one the show mined for years without ever quite making it fully explicit. Tegrity Farms was always as much a vehicle for Randy's self-concept as it was a business. The name said it. Integrity plus the place. The suggestion that this particular person working this particular land had a claim on authentic values that other, lesser ventures lacked. The marijuana he grew was not just marijuana. It was an expression of who Randy Marsh believed himself to be. When that belief became impossible to sustain in the face of his actual behavior, the farm couldn't survive the collapse. There is a version of the Randy Marsh arc that reads as a father failing his family. His daughter Shelley, who was already estranged from the main storyline in ways that reflected a genuine creative neglect of the character across the show's middle seasons, was repositioned in the Tegrity era as someone who resented the farm and what it had done to their lives. Her resentment was earned. The move from South Park to the countryside had been unilateral. It had been Randy's decision, executed with Randy's characteristic confidence that his passion for a thing constituted sufficient reason for everyone around him to reorganize their lives around it. Sharon had followed because she loved him and because she had spent years absorbing his crises and finding ways to survive them. Sharon Marsh is one of the show's most under-examined recurring characters. She has been in the background of Randy's stories for the entire run, providing the reaction that grounds the comedy. The exasperated eye roll, the patient exhaustion of someone who has long since stopped being surprised by her husband and is now simply managing the ongoing situation. She is not a passive character within the story. She has her own opinions, her own limits, her own breaking points. She sold the farm. She made the decision and executed it without asking Randy's permission. And there was nothing he could do about it because it was her name on the deed too. because it was her life the farm had disrupted as much as his, because the quiet authority she exercised at the end of the arc had been building across every season in which she had been in the background, absorbing Randy's enthusiasms without apparent resistance. Towley's presence throughout the Tegrity era is its own small saga. The sentient Towel had been a recurring figure since his introduction in Season 5, where he was presented as a government-created Towel with recreational drug use habits and a tendency to offer Towel-related advice at inappropriate moments. He is, by design, one of the dumbest things the show ever invented, which Parker has confirmed was deliberate. They wanted to create a character who was definitionally pointless, whose presence added nothing, whose only function was to remind the audience that the show could choose to do anything, and sometimes chose to do something completely without merit, because the choice itself was funny. Towley was a joke about creative self-indulgence that then kept appearing for 20-plus seasons. His partnership with Randy at Tegrity Farms gave him the most sustained narrative purpose he had ever had. Randy's interest in cannabis quality and Towley's extensive personal knowledge of cannabis effects aligned so naturally that the partnership felt almost logical, which was itself somehow funnier than a purely absurdist version would have been. The two of them running a farm together, one motivated by a passion for brand and identity, the other motivated by proximity to a substance he already compulsively consumed, was a working relationship built on the kind of mutually convenient misalignment that many real businesses are quietly founded on. Neither of them was in it for precisely the reasons the other assumed. Both of them were getting what they came for. The ICE raid that ended the farm's operation carried political weight in addition to its narrative function. Season 27 aired in an environment of heightened attention to immigration enforcement, and an episode that centered on a farm's dependence on undocumented workers being dismantled by federal agents was not political, incidentally. It was a specific choice about what the end of Randy's era would look like. Not a romantic ending, not a moment of Randy recognizing what he'd done and choosing something better. An ending in which external forces arrived, took the people who had actually done most of the farm's labor while Randy focused on branding and identity, and left him with a property he no longer wanted. Section 8. The Post-COVID Future. What Became of Everyone. The two post-COVID specials released in late 2021 were, among other things, the most fully realized imagining of South Park's future that the show had ever committed to screen. Previous flash-forwards had been brief and primarily comedic. The post-COVID specials were different. They constructed a version of South Park 40 years in the future with enough internal consistency, enough specific detail, and enough genuine pathos that watching them felt less like a joke about the future and more like a genuine reckoning with what these people might actually become. The world of post-COVID is not good. The pandemic has stretched impossibly for 40 years. The year is approximately 2061. Everything has plus or max appended to its name. Every service, institution, and establishment having adopted streaming service naming conventions that have propagated forward through time until they cover everything. Kenny McCormick has just died. His death opens the first special, and it lands differently than his previous ones. There is no, "Oh my God, no you bastards." Kenny died in his 50s as a wealthy, celebrated scientist, working on research into COVID's origins and the possibility of time travel as a correction to the dystopian future. He died of a new COVID variant contracted during a time travel experiment. His passing was newsworthy. People outside South Park knew his name. His funeral drew genuine mourners who valued what he had done. Stan Marsh, at roughly 50, had left South Park years ago and was living in a city, working as an online whiskey consultant, his primary social relationship being with a sentient Amazon Alexa device that functioned as a combination assistant and apparent romantic partner characterized by mutual contempt. He was estranged from his father, from his old friends, from the town. The estrangement was not dramatic or sudden. It had accumulated through the pandemic, through arguments and non-choices, and the grinding long-term damage of restrictions that drove people apart along fault lines that already existed. Stan was not happy. He was used to not being happy, which is a specific, recognizable condition the show depicted with accuracy. Kyle had never left. He stayed in South Park. became a guidance counselor at the elementary school where his childhood played out, worked in the same building where the central events of his life had occurred. He was unmarried. He was single. He was in the way of people who stay when everyone else goes, simultaneously more connected to a place than anyone around them, and in some ways more stranded by that connection than the people who left. He called Stan when Kenny died because Stan was still part of his emotional structure, even after years of estrangement. Cartman had become a rabbi. He had a wife named Yentl, 3 children, an apparent genuine relationship with Jewish religious practice. He used Hebrew phrases, quoted scripture, named his children with the seriousness of someone who cared about the heritage those names carried. Kyle refused to believe any of it. The history between them was too long and too specifically painful. Cartman had spent their entire shared childhood targeting Kyle with a precision that combined anti-Semitism with the particular cruelty of someone who knew exactly where to press. The show maintained both possibilities with equal weight. Either Cartman had genuinely changed, driven by love for his family and the transformation that comes from finding something larger than yourself to commit to, or this was the longest and most elaborate prank he had ever run on anyone. The ambiguity was the point. In the second special, The Return of COVID, the full weight of what Kenny had been trying to do became clear. He had identified the source of the dystopian future. A stupid argument among Stan, Kyle, and Cartman at the start of the pandemic had fractured their friendship, and the fragmented friendship had been the actual catastrophe. Everything else, the stretched-out pandemic, the dystopian society, the miserable futures, had grown from that original break. Kenny had devoted his adult life to developing time travel to go back and fix the moment the friendship fractured. He had died trying. Cartman's behavior in the second special is one of the more complex things the show has done with him in recent years. He was genuinely divided. He wanted to help. But the future he was fighting to preserve was also the future that contained his wife and children, the people he loved most. And those people would cease to exist if the timeline was changed successfully. He spent most of the special opposing Stan and Kyle, fighting to preserve a future that was dystopian for everyone else but was the only version that contained his family. And then, at the critical moment, he helped. He sacrificed his future, his wife, his children, the best version of his life, to do the right thing. The result in the new good timeline was that Cartman was a homeless alcoholic shouting at passersby. His family, who existed only in the bad timeline, were gone. Stan and Kyle, who had benefited from his sacrifice, could only watch him with helpless sympathy. He had done the most genuinely selfless thing the character had ever done, and the result was that he was alone and miserable in ways he couldn't understand. The universe, as always, had no accounting mechanism for good behavior. In the good timeline, Kenny won the Nobel Prize for combining dark matter with breast implants. Stan was in what appeared to be space military. Jimmy Valmer was back to doing the comedy he actually loved rather than the sanitized material he'd been forced into. Shelley Marsh was alive. Sharon was alive. The Marsh family was intact. Craig Tucker and Tweek Tweek were together in both timelines. Across both versions of the future, across both the bad 40 years and the good ones, Craig and Tweek remained a couple. Whatever else had failed, or been lost, or been distorted beyond recognition, that particular thing survived every version of events the show could imagine. It is the most quietly satisfying detail in the specials for anyone who has been paying attention to their story across the many seasons between their Season 3 introduction and the specials' 2061 future. The specials also functioned as a reckoning with the question of what the show's pandemic episodes had actually been saying. The COVID specials of 2020 and 2021 had been made in real time as the world was living through lockdowns, uncertainty, and the specific anxiety of a crisis that had no clear endpoint. Parker and Stone were producing episodes in their standard 6-day window about events that were still happening outside their office windows. The shows that resulted were, by the show's own later implicit acknowledgement, somewhat unfocused. The pandemic specials were records of a moment more than they were fully formed satire. The post-COVID specials were the retrospective. They asked what the pandemic's actual damage had been. Not the disease itself, but the social rupture, the way extended crisis periods crack. friendships and families along fault lines that were always there, but that normal life holds together through proximity and routine. The show had always been interested in friendship as a moral category. The central relationship of four boys who stay friends despite fundamental incompatibilities, Cartman's sociopathy, Kenny's poverty, Stan's occasional cowardice, Kyle's earnestness, had been the show's structural heart since the pilot. The post-COVID specials proposed that what really broke people during those years was not the disease, but the arguments about the disease, the political divisions, the physical distance that calcified into emotional distance. Stan's life in the future is a catalog of small contemporary failures arranged into a recognizable portrait of a middle-aged person who has replaced actual connection with its functional approximations. The Alexa device he argued with in his apartment was explicitly positioned as a stand-in for human relationship. She expressed frustration with him, and he expressed frustration with her. There was banter that had the rhythm of a long domestic arrangement without any of its substance. He had not visited South Park in years. He had let the relationships that defined his childhood atrophy to the point where he had to be told that Kenny was dead rather than hearing about it through any natural channel of connection. Kenny's death in the future hit differently than every previous death for multiple reasons. He was old enough for his death to be expected. He had done something with his life. The Nobel Prize, the time travel research, the attempt to correct the past. These were the actions of someone who had decided that his strange relationship with mortality and suffering carried an obligation, that if he was going to keep surviving things, he should do something with the survival. The framing of his final project, using time travel to fix the moment the childhood friends had a stupid argument that fractured their friendship, is perhaps the most sentimental thing the show has ever committed to seriously rather than ironically. Kenny McCormick, who had died hundreds of times in crude and comedic ways throughout his childhood, spent the last years of his adult life trying to give his best friends a chance to stay friends. That is the kind of arc that takes 20-plus years to earn. Cartman's situation in the specials contains the most fully realized version of the moral complexity the character had been building towards since Scott Tenorman must die. His family, Yentl, the children, the whole impossible-seeming life he had apparently built through whatever combination of genuine change and sustained performance the show declined to specify, existed only because the bad timeline existed. The world that had been 40 years of dystopian misery for everyone else was the world in which he had found his people and made something that mattered to him. His sacrifice of that world is the act the show clearly intends as significant. It is, without dramatic inflation, the most generous thing Cartman has ever done. And then the good timeline gave him nothing. He was a homeless alcoholic. Stan and Kyle looked at him and didn't know what to do with the fact that they owed him everything and that the price of what he'd given them had been everything he had. The show left it there. No redemption scene, no acknowledgement within the fiction of what he'd actually done. No reward that would have tidied the moment into a lesson. Just the two friends watching the person who saved them stand in the road and shout at nothing. The universe remains, as always in South Park, indifferent to acts of genuine goodness. Section 9. Forgotten. Supporting characters and the Deep Town lore. South Park is populated by dozens of recurring figures who exist in the margins of the main narrative, accumulating small details across years of episodes that add up to something resembling actual lives. These are the characters who are never the focus of an episode, but who show up consistently enough that their presence feels earned. They behave according to consistent internal logic. They carry forward details from previous appearances. They occasionally do something surprising that turns out to be entirely consistent with everything we've seen from them if we've been paying attention. Following them is the particular pleasure of long-term viewership. Tweak Tweak arrived in Season 3 as a potential Kenny replacement, a child given excessive caffeine by his coffee shop-owning parents, in quantities that kept him in a perpetual state of anxiety and hypervigilance. He twitched constantly. He saw danger in situations that didn't contain any. He worried with the intensity of someone unable to distinguish between real threats and imaginary ones, which in South Park, where the threats are frequently real and often much worse than anticipated, put him in an interesting epistemic position. His parents promoted his caffeinated state either out of genuine ignorance or because a perpetually caffeinated child who spent all his time in their coffee shop was good for business. His relationship with Craig Tucker was established as a misunderstanding in season 3. The children of South Park convinced themselves, through the mechanism of schoolyard rumor, that Tweek and Craig were secretly a couple. Both boys were furious at the assumption. Neither was in a relationship with the other. The episode played the situation as comedy about how children process and create narratives from incomplete data. Craig and Tweek denied the relationship. That appeared to be the end of it. In season 19, without any episode marking the transition, they were simply a couple. The implication was that the schoolyard rumor had been a child's intuition about something real, and that somewhere in the years the camera wasn't watching, something had actually happened between them. The town had been right. They had found their way to acknowledging it off-screen, and by the time the show caught up with them, they were together in the matter-of-fact way of people who have been together long enough that it no longer requires explanation. Tolkien Black went through a name change that was handled quietly for something that rewrote 16 seasons of established history. Tolkien Black had been in the show since season 1. The only black child in the South Park elementary class, his name an explicit joke about the structural problem of tokenism in American television. In season 25, an episode acknowledged that everyone had been mispronouncing and misspelling his name for decades. His name was Tolkien, after J.R.R. Tolkien, whose work his father loved. They had always been saying it wrong. He had probably been correcting people his whole life and being misheard. The show updated official materials, changed his name in all subsequent appearances, and in a piece of retroactive continuity requiring no explicit justification beyond the announcement of the correction, he became Tolkien Black. PC Principal arrived in season 19 as a satirical target, a muscular, aggressive embodiment of university political correctness culture, enforcing progressive social norms with physical intimidation. He was designed to be mocked, and the show mocked him effectively. But he stayed. He developed a child with Vice Principal Strongwoman. He made choices that reflected genuine values rather than just a set of positions. He became over time something more like a flawed person with a coherent worldview than a straw man representing a single tendency. His presence in the school building has been consistent across nearly 10 seasons, and his character has deepened with that consistency. Chef's memorial is worth revisiting in the context of the show's quiet attention to its own history. When season 12's episode The China Problem aired in 2008, it ended with a title card dedicating the episode to the memory of Chef. Not to Isaac Hayes, the man who voiced him, though Hayes had died in August of that year. The dedication was specifically to Chef, the character, the person who had fed the boys and dispensed warmth, and maintained the show's capacity for genuine affection beneath its surface cynicism. The writers had loved Chef the way you love the characters you've lived with for years, and the memorial was for him specifically. The distinction between the man and the character, made explicit in that small card, says something about how the show understood its own relationship to the people who inhabited it. Jimmy Valmer, the stand-up comedian with a stutter who arrived in season 5, is treated by the show with an unusual respect for his ambition. He works at being funny. He is funny in the show's internal reality as well as from the audience's perspective. The show treats this talent as real rather than as ironic contrast. In the post-COVID future, he had muted himself, doing safe, sanitized comedy to avoid offending an impossibly sensitive audience, successful by external measures but hollowed out by the compromise. In the good timeline, he was back to the work that actually meant something to him. It is a small arc, but it has the shape of something the show cared about. Timmy Birch arrived in season 4 and has been continuously present ever since, making him one of the longest-running recurring characters in the show's history. His vocabulary, for most of his run, consisted of his own name spoken in varying tones, a fact that the show has exploited in various ways across multiple seasons. The season 4 episode Timmy 2000 introduced him, and the episode's central joke was that the children of South Park, having been placed on Ritalin by doctors responding to their parents' anxiety about attention, were rendered incapable of perceiving that Timmy's performances were simply him saying his own name repeatedly at a rock concert. The medicated children heard profundity. They heard musicality and meaning in a sound pattern that contained neither. The episode used Timmy's communication style as a lens on the diagnostic enthusiasm of the early 2000s. The willingness to pathologize ordinary childhood behavior, and the numbing of perception that followed treatment. What the show did over subsequent seasons was refuse to reduce Timmy to the joke. He had friendships, including his long-running relationship with Jimmy, that was the show's closest sustained engagement with how disabled children exist in relation to each other and to a world not designed for them. He had preferences. He had emotional responses that were readable even without the verbal specificity other characters used. He went on adventures. He was the subject of an episode about the discrimination and complicated politics of the Special Olympics in Season 8. He was part of the group of peripheral class members who showed up consistently enough across 20-plus seasons to feel like people the audience knew, even if the show never dedicated an episode entirely to their interior lives. The ongoing treatment of Wendy Testaberger across the show's run is one of the more complicated character trajectories in the supporting cast. She arrived as Stan's girlfriend, his primary romantic concern, the person who made him physically ill with nervousness, in the way that early elementary school attractions work in the show's specific emotional register. She was smart, opinionated, capable, and frequently the most competent person in a given situation. The show positioned her as a foil for Cartman in multiple episodes, where their genuine ideological opposition drove the story. Wendy's arc is also notable for being the show's most sustained engagement with what it looks like when a smart, principled person has to operate within institutions and social structures that are not built for smart, principled people. She runs for class office and loses to candidates with no discernible qualifications because the electorate responds to different signals than competence. She fights Cartman on substantive issues and wins the arguments while losing the social battles because winning arguments and winning socially require different skills, and Cartman has the second set in abundance. She is, more than any other character in the supporting cast, a portrait of the specific frustration of being right in an environment that does not especially reward being right. Her relationship with Stan has been intermittent throughout the show's run. They have broken up and gotten back together in ways that reflect the general instability of elementary school romantic attachment, while also reflecting something about how the show handles continuity in its secondary character relationships. They are together when the story needs them to be and apart when the story finds that more useful. The inconsistency is the show's pragmatism at work, and like many of the show's pragmatic continuity choices, it has accumulated into something that feels almost realistic. Because real relationships among children and adolescents are intermittent and inconsistent in precisely this way. Kenny's sister Karen deserves specific mention because she represents a relatively recent addition to established lore that retroactively enriched everything the show had already done with Kenny. Karen McCormick had existed as a background figure in Kenny's household for years, before Season 16 gave her genuine narrative purpose. The episode Mysterion Rises had revealed that Kenny's secret superhero persona, Mysterion, existed partly because of his need to protect his little sister from the household dysfunction and neighborhood threats that surrounded their lives. Karen believed in Mysterion because she had to believe in something, and Kenny was careful to maintain for her sake a persona that allowed her to trust in protection rather than understand the scale of what she was being protected from. He was her guardian angel in the specific South Park sense. Actively present, regularly dying, always returning. Never quite able to make the world safe enough, but unable to stop trying. This dimension of Kenny's character, the protective sibling function running underneath the crude comedy surface, had been available in the show's background since early seasons, in the occasional glimpse of his home life, in the economic desperation of the McCormick household that stood in contrast to the relatively comfortable domestic settings of the other boys. Kenny's poverty had always been a joke, and also clearly not a joke. Karen's presence made the not-a-joke dimension more specific and more affecting, without changing the surface register of how the show handled Kenny in general. The McCormick house as a recurring environment is one of South Park's less examined background details. It appears on the same street as the other boys' houses, close enough to be part of the same neighborhood, different enough in visible upkeep to mark economic distance within that proximity. The parents, Stuart and Carol McCormick, were for many seasons present primarily as background evidence of dysfunction. Drinking, arguing, occasionally violent, living in conditions that explained without excusing the general chaotic state of their children's home environment. The show never turned the McCormick poverty into a sustained, serious storyline, which is consistent with its general approach of acknowledging real social problems through the texture of background details rather than through explicit narrative engagement. Section 10. The show's secret continuity, how South Park remembers what it pretends to forget. One of the most persistent critical observations about South Park is that it lacks real continuity, that events don't carry forward meaningfully, that characters don't change across seasons, that each episode is essentially its own isolated island. This observation is partially accurate in the most literal sense. The show has never committed to a strict, serialized timeline. Characters age slowly or not at all. Deaths that were treated with genuine seriousness occasionally become non-permanent when the story requires it. The casual viewer can watch almost any episode in almost any order without feeling lost. But underneath that intentionally soft surface, if you spend enough time with the show across enough seasons, there is something harder. Things do carry forward. Characters do accumulate specific histories that inform later behavior. A detail planted in Season 2 becomes a cornerstone of a Season 14 arc. A joke from Season 8 returns in Season 11 as the foundation of a three-part event. A character introduced as a brief punchline returns 15 seasons later to provide crucial information about an ongoing mystery. The show has a memory, and it uses that memory selectively and often in ways that function as deep rewards for the attentive long-term viewer, without ever making the casual viewer feel excluded. Scott Tenorman Must Die from Season 5 is the clearest single example of how the show's continuity works at its most effective. The episode aired in July of 2001, and it remains one of the highest-rated episodes in the show's history on audience review sites. The premise: Cartman was humiliated by a high school-aged boy named Scott Tenorman, who tricked him into buying pubic hair. Cartman spent the episode devising revenge schemes, all of which failed. The failures were funny. His confidence in approaches that went nowhere provided the episode's forward momentum. And then the finale. Cartman had arranged for Scott's parents to be shot by a farmer, manipulating events with extraordinary precision, so they trespassed on his property at exactly the wrong moment. He had their bodies ground into chili. He served the chili to Scott at a community chili cook-off. Scott ate it. He loved it. Cartman revealed what Scott had just consumed. He watched Scott cry. He licked the tears off Scott's face with an expression that was, even in a show that had established Cartman as cruel, shocking in its coldness. He had planned this from the beginning. Every failed scheme, every apparent defeat, had been part of the architecture leading to this specific moment. That episode changed Cartman permanently. The other characters didn't respond to it as the revelation about his character that it was. They mostly didn't. Cartman didn't acknowledge or reflect on it. He didn't. But the audience could never again watch Cartman be funny without some part of their awareness carrying the knowledge of what he was capable of at his worst. He had murdered 2 people and fed them to their child for a personal slight about pubic hair. That was the floor. Every subsequent Cartman episode exists with that floor visible in the background. Scott Tenorman himself returned in Season 14, where the history of the original episode was recontextualized in ways that connected it to the show's deepest ongoing mystery, the question of Cartman's actual parentage. The reveal gave the original episode's tragedy dimensions it hadn't appeared to have, connecting a piece of early Season 5 writing to ongoing plot threads that were still active more than a decade later. The Cartman father question is the show's most persistently unresolved narrative thread. It began as a Season 1 finale cliffhanger, was famously not answered by the Season 2 premiere, received an absurdist resolution in the following episode involving Leanne Cartman being a hermaphrodite who fathered herself, and then continued to accumulate complexity through the involvement of Mitch Connor, the hand-turned con artist persona of uncertain ontological status who claimed knowledge of Cartman's real lineage, and through the reappearance of Mr. Hat with his Vietnam War backstory and his connection to Mitch Connor. The question of who Cartman's father was, which was introduced as a Season 1 cliffhanger, has become one of the longest-running, unresolved mysteries in the show's history. The revelation at San Diego Comic-Con in July of 2025 that Parker and Stone themselves use fan wikis and community databases to track the details of their own show's history was a moment of genuine transparency about how South Park's continuity actually functions. They have made over 330 episodes at a pace of one per week, written and produced in 6 days each, with minimal time for reflection between completion and broadcast. The institutional memory of what happened in specific episodes, what a character's established history enables or precludes, what callbacks are available, all of that lives primarily in the accumulated documentation of the fan community. When Parker said they can look on any South Park fan database and find out who a character's mother is, he was acknowledging that the show's canon is maintained through a collaborative process between the people who write it and the people who watch it. This creates a loop with no direct equivalent in television history. The creators make the show. The fans document it. The creators consult the documentation. The fans update the documentation with new content. The creators consult the updates. The show's canon is maintained through collaboration between people who write it and people who watch it, with neither party fully in control and neither able to entirely account for what the other has contributed. It is, in its strange way, as fitting as the show's origins in a viral Christmas card that spread on floppy disks before most people had reliable email access. The specific mechanism the show uses to reward this attentive community is a pattern of callbacks that operate at very different distances from their original moments. Some callbacks are one season out. A detail established in an early episode is reversed or complicated in the same season's later episodes. Some are a decade out. A name mentioned once in a throwaway line in Season 5 becomes the key to understanding a central plot point in Season 15. And some are over 2 decades out. Things from the earliest seasons that only make sense in the context of lore that hadn't been established yet. The example that illustrates the full range of this best is probably the Kenny revelation arc. From Season 1 through Season 5, Kenny's deaths were presented as a recurring joke with minimal mythology attached. He died each episode in ways ranging from mundane to elaborate. In the Season 5 finale, he died permanently, not as a joke, as an actual narrative choice, with an illness that progressed across multiple episodes and a death that was treated with genuine weight. He was absent for most of Season 6. The show found this to be a mistake and brought him back in the Season 6 finale without explanation, which was its own kind of joke about how the show had never been serious about the deaths in the first place. And then Season 14 pulled all of it together. The Coon and Friends episodes revealed that Kenny's deaths and resurrections were not a running gag, but an actual supernatural situation. His mother had attended a Cthulhu cult ritual while pregnant, which had resulted in Kenny being tied to an ancient cycle of death and rebirth that he could not escape. He died. He woke up at home. His parents had no memory of his death. He alone carried the knowledge of it, which meant he alone carried the psychological weight of having died and returned over and over since he could remember. Mysterion, his superhero identity, had the power of immortality, not as a gift, as a curse. He could not be killed permanently. He would wake up again. The horror of this was presented straightforwardly and then surrounded by superhero parody comedy without either tone canceling the other out. This retroactively gave every previous death a different weight. The running gag had been, from the show's internal mythological perspective, a child experiencing a curse. The audience had been laughing at something that was, once the mythology was revealed, a portrait of genuine suffering. Whether that reframing is rewarding or uncomfortable probably depends on the viewer, but it is unambiguously an intentional move. The show placed lore underneath a joke and then lifted the joke to show what was underneath, and both layers remained visible simultaneously after the reveal. Stan's connection to Cthulhu across the Coon and Friends episodes adds another layer to this mythology. The elder deity appeared as a purple cloud of inconceivable scale, and Cartman had managed to befriend it and direct it against his personal enemies, which was very Cartman as an application of cosmic power. Stan's mother's cult affiliation was the source of Kenny's curse. The Lovecraftian underpinning of Kenny's situation puts him in a tradition of cosmic horror that runs beneath the construction paper surface of the show, in ways that are never really resolved or dispelled. Something very old and very beyond human comprehension is involved in the McCormick family's story. The show has never returned to that thread in the same explicit way it was laid out in season 14, but it is still technically there in the mythology. An open thread dangling from an ancient narrative that the show chose not to pull all the way through. The 4-episode Coon and Friends arc also introduced Mintberry Crunch, Bradley Biggle, the child who believed himself to be the superhero Mintberry Crunch, with powers derived from mint and berries. He was positioned as a comedic foil throughout the arc, his powers useless and his self-confidence unearned. And then in the final episode, it was revealed that he was in fact the alien Gokzara, an incredibly powerful being of cosmic significance whose true destiny was to fight the actual darkness of Cthulhu himself. His powers were genuine. His purpose was real. He was, by any measurement, the most powerful individual to have ever appeared in the South Park universe. He defeated Cthulhu, returned to his home planet, and has not been mentioned again. Mintberry Crunch, the savior of reality, was a one-time event. The show returned to its normal register immediately after his departure, and has never revisited the question of whether the most powerful being to ever appear in this universe might be relevant to any subsequent situation involving supernatural threat. The show's mythology around the 4 boys themselves, Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny, is built on a consistent internal logic about friendship as the actual moral unit. Not individual goodness, not adherence to principles, not religious observance, not any external moral framework. Friendship. The specific commitment to staying connected to particular people across time and difficulty. The post-COVID specials built their entire moral architecture around this premise, that the worst outcome of the pandemic years was not the disease, but the friendships that didn't survive them. That the one thing worth traveling backward through time to protect was a moment when 4 kids were still each other's people. This places South Park in a surprisingly traditional moral register. The show that has been called nihilistic, anarchic, and morally vacant for nearly 30 years turns out to have a consistent moral foundation, and that foundation is the oldest and least complicated moral claim. That the relationships between specific people matter, that losing them is a genuine loss, and that the things we do to preserve or destroy them have weight. Everything else, the satire, the shock content, the religious controversy, the political provocations, operates on top of that foundation, often in ways that complicate or contradict it, but the foundation is always there. Parker has described the central emotional engine of the show as his genuine love for the specific combination of those 4 characters and what they produce together. Not any individual one, not the dynamic of any 2 of them, but the specific thing that happens when all 4 interact. The comedy, the drama, the moral complexity, the capacity for genuine emotion underneath the protective layer of vulgarity. All of it requires the full configuration. This is why the post-COVID specials, which showed that configuration broken across 40 years, landed with the weight that they did. The audience had been watching those 4 people for decades. The stakes were genuinely felt. Bonus section. The deep continuity. Objects, places, and things that carry history. There are objects in South Park that have been present for so long that their persistence has become its own category of lore. The couch in the Cartman living room, where Leanna and her parade of lovers have conducted their domestic life in the background of Cartman's various schemes. The bus stop where the boys wait each morning, the first and last image of hundreds of episodes, a fixed geographic anchor around which the weekly chaos organizes itself. The recurring structure of that establishing shot, the yellow snow, the mountains in the background, the 4 figures in their coats, is one of the most recognizable single images in American television history. The McCormick house's front door is orange. The Marsh house's door is red. The Broflovsky house has a blue door. Cartman's house has a tan exterior with specific landscaping that has remained consistent across 20-plus years. These visual details have been maintained with a consistency that the show's casual reputation would not suggest. and they function as orientation points in the same way that familiar details in real towns orient the people who live in them. South Park, the place, is real in the sense that it has consistent geography, established relative positions of streets, houses, the school, the police station, the mall, the mountains visible to the east and north, that has been honored in episode after episode across 3 decades. The continuity of the town's physical layout is almost never commented on within the show, which is part of how it works. Nobody points out that things are consistent. They simply are consistent in the way that reality is consistent without anyone calling attention to its consistency. The show has invested in the realness of its impossible place with the same quiet commitment that it has invested in the realness of its impossible characters. Chef's memorial, placed at a specific location in the town geography after his departure, represents a physical site in the show's landscape that carries both narrative history and emotional weight. It marks where he was. It does not explain what happened. It exists in the way that real memorials exist, as a physical acknowledgement that something occurred here that mattered to the people who lived through it, without any text elaborate enough to capture why. The school building, South Park Elementary, has burned down, been destroyed, been rebuilt, been altered, and returned to something like its original state across multiple episodes. The building's persistence despite repeated catastrophic damage is one of the show's running background jokes about the futility of large-scale destruction in a world that simply resets by next week. But within any given season, the building's interiors are maintained with surprising consistency. Principal's office layout, cafeteria arrangement, classroom structure, these are reliable enough that their occasional alterations read as meaningful rather than as continuity errors. The gymnasium, where so many town meetings and school events have occurred, has hosted some of the show's most sustained comedic set pieces. The various Randy Marsh moments, the Cartman schemes that required a public audience, the community crises that required everyone to be in one room so they could collectively make the wrong decision. South Park as a community has a recurring tendency to gather in that room, hear various presentations of information, and respond to all of them with a herd logic that cycles through panic, denial, and enthusiastic embrace of whatever the most recent confident speaker proposed. The gymnasium is the arena where South Park's most consistent political satire happens. Not about national politics, but about the specific mechanics of how small communities make decisions, which turns out to be one of the show's most durable and accurate ongoing observations. The relationship between the town's Catholic community and the town's Jewish community has been a background texture across many episodes, expressed primarily through the contrast between the Cartman and Broflovsky households, and through the specific ways that Kyle's Judaism functions as a target for Cartman's anti-Semitism, and as a source of genuine moral seriousness in Kyle's own character. South Park is not a town without religion. It has a church. It has religious events on the calendar. What it does with religion is consistently treat it as human rather than divine, as a set of practices and beliefs that specific people hold for specific personal reasons rather than as a system of truth that organizes everything else. This perspective, applied to every religion the show has addressed, produces satire that is more interested in what religion does to and for people than in whether any particular religion's claims are valid. The town's position in Colorado is not incidental. The show is set in a specific real location, South Park, Colorado, a high-altitude basin south of Denver, and draws on the specific character of that place, its weather, its landscape, its history as a region that experienced rapid transformations during the mining era and then a long period of relative isolation. Parker and Stone grew up in Colorado. The mountains in the background of the show are not generic mountains. They are the mountains those two people grew up looking at. The cold is not generic cold. The snow arrives in specific quantities at specific times of year in a way that the show's visual language reflects with the casual accuracy of people who know a place from inside rather than from research. This grounding in real geography is part of what makes South Park feel, despite everything, like somewhere rather than nowhere. The physical world the show is set in has weight and consistency. The impossible things that happen in it, the aliens, the visits from Satan, the portal to imagination land, the various supernatural events, are made funnier and stranger by happening in a specific real place rather than in a generic animated environment. When Cthulhu appears over the mountains that look like the mountains visible from Parker's hometown, the collision of the cosmic and the local is precisely calibrated. The show has always known exactly where it is. That specificity of place, the way two particular people have been making jokes about one particular small town in one particular state for nearly 30 years, is the last and most important piece of the show's mythology that rarely gets named directly. South Park is not a generic anywhere. It is a genuine somewhere that carries the weight of two people's actual memories and actual geography and actual love for a particular high-altitude Colorado landscape. The lore lives there. The characters live there. Every impossible thing that has happened across 3 decades has happened in the long shadow of those specific mountains, under that specific sky, in that specific thin, cold air. The construction paper was always that place. Everything else grew up around it. 3 decades of lore produced at the pace of a daily newspaper by 2 men from Colorado who are still in the writer's room, still making each other laugh, still following premises to their most uncomfortable conclusions, still putting impossible things matter-of-factly in the middle of the frame and seeing who notices. There is always more. There will be more next week. And the week after that, for as long as the show keeps going, which based on the evidence of everything that came before will probably be longer than either of us expects.